today call Orthodox Christians. This is because the label Christian, all by itself, was used to refer to followers of Marcion. Based on this and other evidence, many historians believe that Marcionites represented the majority party of Christians in the Eastern Roman and Western Persian empires. As is the case with many such figures in early Christian history, the end of Marcion's life is shrouded in mystery. Marcion was probably more successful than his opponents wished to advertise. Heresiologists would prefer that Marcion's story ended when he was expelled from what they considered the true church. It did them no good to record that Marcion died the esteemed founder of a pan-Mediterranean network of churches. Modern historians are left to infer what they can from stories about Marcion's many disciples, the communities that revered him, and all the other Christians who felt compelled to respond to Marcion's influential ideas. The invention of the Christian Bible. So, we've met Marcion. Now, what does it mean to say that he invented the Christian Bible? Today we encounter the Bible as a single pleather-bound volume with tiny print and a helpful table of contents, but the Bible, of course, is not a single work. It may be one physical book, but that book is an anthology of several dozen works. Modern Bibles collect independently circulating books composed by ancient Israelites, Second Temple Jews, and early Christians. As such, modern Bibles will vary in their contents. The Jewish Study Bible, King James Version, and Orthodox Study Bible, to name a few, are all widely read English translations with different tables of content. On top of that, the English translations of any one work within these different Bibles is based on different underlying text traditions. The Jewish and Orthodox Study Bibles are not even translating the same text of Genesis. Given this diverse body of literature that circulates under the same deceptively simple title, what is a Bible? Here's a simple definition for the sake of this discussion: a collection of books deemed uniquely authoritative by a religious community. This working definition seems to cover the spectrum of ordinary uses of the term. Such a concept, it's important to recognize, is distinct from the notions of scripture and canon. To clarify what I am not claiming for Marcion, it's important to unpack these related notions really quick. Christians had authoritative texts, aka scripture, well before Marcion. With only a few possible exceptions, the works now collected in modern Bibles were written before Marcion came to Rome. For instance, Christians started using various books about Jesus as well as Paul's letters as scriptural authorities sometime in the late 1st century. Sometimes these circulated in individual book rolls or sometimes in small collections of related works. Marcion did not invent scripture, but still, 1st century believers had no single Bible. The question of canon is trickier. Literally speaking, the term refers to a measuring instrument. Applied metaphorically to a religious, intellectual, or literary tradition, a canon is the collection of sources against which other sources of information should be evaluated. Canons, therefore, are catalogs of authoritative sources. Some Jews in the 1st and 2nd centuries, like the priest-turned-historian Josephus, had produced canon lists of the Jewish scriptures. There's good evidence, however, that Christians before Marcion had not yet developed a canon for their own scriptures. Christians in the 2nd century took an ad hoc approach to their scriptures. That is, they used whichever books they thought preserved the life and teachings of Jesus and his apostles, without any appeal to an authoritative standard. Justin, an Orthodox contemporary of Marcion in Rome, utilized a Gospel of Peter, an infancy gospel, and other sayings of Jesus without any known source, all of which are non-canonical today. Another Orthodox Christian of the same time, Tatian, just wrote his own gospel. Early Orthodox sermons, like the work known as Second Clement, and summaries of the gospel, like that found in the Epistle of the Apostles, recount stories of Jesus found in both canonical and non-canonical gospels. Clearly, Christians of all stripes, including the would-be Orthodox, used a variety of gospels throughout the 2nd century. But Marcion, decades before any other proponent of a Christian canon, took a different approach. Gospels that depict Jesus fulfilling the law or prophets had been corrupted, according to Marcion, by the ever-present temptation to Judaize. So he published an exactly one gospel alongside a collection of exactly 10 Pauline epistles. Marcion introduced this selection of Christian scriptures with his own original composition, the Antitheses. This work attacked other gospels, argued for the acceptance of Marcion's chosen scriptures, and introduced Marcion's theological system. We don't know whether Marcion bound these 12 works into a single codex, although one relatively late Syriac source suggests he did. Still, Marcion set out a list of precisely which Christian writings were authoritative for his churches, and in his antitheses, pointedly excluded the alternatives. This collection of scriptures, produced by a so-called heretic sometime in the mid-2nd century, has a strong claim to be the first Christian Bible. Now, here's something I find really amusing because it just strikes me as so weird by today's standards. Marcion's Bible did not actually evoke controversy in 2nd century Rome. By all accounts, Marcion's conflict with the elders in Rome concerned the interpretation of Jesus traditions, not competing Christian canons. That is, Marcion and his Roman interlocutors argued over what Jesus meant by such and such, not what books Christians should read. This shows just how innovative the idea was. It was so novel that the Orthodox weren't even mad about it. And I mean, why would they be? There was no competing Christian canon. It would only be later, in response to Marcion, that Christians would argue for an Orthodox canon of Christian scriptures against Marcion's canon. It wouldn't be until Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century that Marcion's critics would assert an alternative fourfold gospel collection. Even then, Irenaeus himself draws on other collections of Jesus traditions in his own works. In the end, Marcion's work compelled his opponents to articulate their own conceptions of Christian scripture and, in turn, craft a rival Christian canon. This would take decades to popularize and centuries to standardize. In this way, Marcion not only produced the first Christian Bible, but also inspired his Orthodox opponents to build a Bible of their own. The contents of Marcion's Bible. We've discussed the phenomenon of Marcion's Bible without saying much about its actual content. Which singular gospel did Marcion choose, and which 10 letters of Paul? Answering this question entangles us in a series of historical puzzles. Marcion's opponents, our only source of information about Marcion, agree that he took a copy of the Gospel of Luke and rewrote it to eliminate all the problematic connections between Jesus and Judaism. The Lucan Nativity, for instance, is full of references to Jewish scripture, depicting Jesus as the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. So, Marcion, according to his opponents at least, simply removed the entire sequence. He did the same to the preaching of John the Baptist, Jesus' baptism, and about a quarter of Luke's gospel. Now, this heresiologist named Tertullian got in some pretty wicked burns on Marcion. In his 5-volume work dedicated to attacking Marcion, Tertullian calls him the Pontic Mouse in order to, describe Marcion gnawing apart the gospel. In another memorable line, Tertullian says Marcion wrote his gospel with a knife instead of a pen. I like that one a little bit better. Marcion's opponents want you to imagine Marcion creating a custom gospel by just tearing apart an old one. There's an ongoing scholarly debate on this point. Some scholars have argued that Marcion just promoted a gospel and letter collection that he received from his home church, and that the idea that Marcion himself edited and compiled his scriptures was an invention of Marcion's critics. After all, these scholars say, Marcion's Bible preserved some passages that we would have expected Marcion to delete. Still, most scholars think Marcion was responsible for his distinctive scriptures for the following reasons. There is plenty of evidence that Luke existed more or less in its received non-Marcionite form before and throughout Marcion's ministry, meaning that Marcion promoted a highly distinctive form of this gospel. Marcion's gospel doesn't seem to have been utilized much outside of Marcionite communities, suggesting that it originated within the same sect. With the Creator and his law, the patriarchs, and the prophets written out of Jesus' words, Marcion's gospel and letters seem to have been rewritten in a way that fits his theology just a little too well. So was Marcion responsible for the distinctive shape of his scriptures? I'll let you decide. Actually, no, I take that back. Let the scholars decide on this one because, let's face it, you and I, we know really nothing on this subject compared to actual scholars in the field. Let's let them figure it out. By all reports, Marcion's treatment of the Pauline text was more conservative than his treatment of the gospel. A few references to God's covenant with the people of Israel are omitted from Romans and Galatians, but Marcion included Paul's other epistles unaltered. Marcion did not include the pastoral epistles, but that's probably because Marcion just never knew they existed. Scholars now widely recognize these works as later pseudepigrapha, which were probably not yet widely accepted as Pauline in the first half of the 2nd century. By the way, in a previous video, I go into detail about why scholars don't think these books were written by Paul. I'll link that in the cards and description for you to check out after you get done watching this one. The only other significant difference between Marcion's Bible and the Pauline corpus in modern Bibles is the title of the Epistle to the Ephesians. In Marcion's collection, this letter was titled the Epistle to the Laodiceans. Some surviving manuscripts of the Epistle to the Ephesians lack the address to the church in Ephesus. Also, a reference in Colossians to a companion letter to the Laodiceans suggests that the Epistle to Ephesians was once known by this other name. So this difference in titles probably wasn't Marcion's doing. Now, you might be wondering how we know all of this if no manuscripts of any of Marcion's scriptures has survived, and Marcion's work is only preserved in the work of his critics. Although this kind of evidence does present difficulties, the situation really isn't as desperate as it might sound. Tertullian, a 3rd century heresiologist I mentioned earlier, dedicated the entire 4th volume of a 5-volume treatise to a passage-by-passage critique of Marcion's Gospel. His 5th volume does the same with Marcion's Pauline epistles. A little over 100 years later, another ecclesiastical writer named Epiphanius independently composed a critique of Marcion and his Bible. Like Tertullian, Epiphanius quotes Marcion's Bible extensively. Apart from these two sources, a dozen other authors in antiquity discuss Marcion's Bible. Although there are significant holes in our knowledge and uncertainties around specific wording, Marcion's scriptures can be reconstructed in remarkable detail, considering that we have no direct text tradition. All right, now to sum up what we've covered, the so-called heretic Marcion, it seems, was the first Christian to promote an exhaustive collection of uniquely authoritative texts. The first Christian Bible was invented to exclude both the Jewish scriptures and other Christian writings as textual authorities. In response, non-Marcionite Christians were compelled to defend their use of other gospel texts and formulate how they believed the Jewish scriptures should be used in Christian theology and practice.